A low wind curls through the narrow throat of Aruna Pass, rustling tamarisk leaves like whispers from the underworld. The rising sun, reluctant and red, spills sideways through the gorge, painting the cliffs in blood and bronze. Dust stirs beneath hoof and sandal, catching in the folds of linen cloaks, in the creases beneath helms. The sound is muffled, wood on stone, leather creaking, the steady breath of oxen. And above it all, silence. That heavy, holy kind of silence that gathers before men die. Pharaoh Thutmose stands upright in his chariot, the reins slack in his calloused grip. His gold circlet gleams, but beneath the sacred regalia, his eyes are tired, ancient even. The cold of the desert night still lingers on his breath. Behind him, row upon row of soldiers file through the pass, shoulders hunched beneath bronze and burden, their shadows stretching like spears across the rock. The route is madness, his counselors had warned. Suicide to march an army through a choke so narrow that 2 horses abreast must slow to 1. Better to go the long way. Better to live. But Thutmose had chosen boldness. Not for pride, for memory, for legacy. He knew the stones of history would not remember the safe road. They would remember the narrow one, the defiant one, carved by gods and gambled by kings. At the other end of the gorge, the valley of Megiddo yawns wide and waiting, wrapped in the cool hush of early morning. The city crouches atop its tell, a scab of mud brick and battlement rising from fertile plain. Beyond its walls, the armies of the Canaanite princes are already watching. Scouts crouch behind thorn trees, eyes glinting with disbelief. They had not thought he would come this way. They had not thought he dared. In the city, the high gate remains shut, sealed the night before with iron bolts and cedar planks swelled by dew. Inside, the hearths are cold, the loaves stale, the wells ring with the sounds of desperate hands. Women gather their children close, whispering old prayers into small, wide ears. Priests smear lamb's blood on lintels, not to ward death, but to acknowledge it. And yet, Megiddo is not afraid. Not yet. Its people remember walls that have stood for generations. They believe in gods who do not blink. They believe in the princes who arrived from Kadesh, from Tyre, from Hazor. They believe their alliance is strong. But belief is brittle when it sits on bronze and stone. The pass narrows once more. Chariot wheels grind against the walls. Men duck their helms beneath jagged rock. Still the line pushes forward, endless, silent, a serpent of death unwinding through the bones of the earth. The tension is unbearable, a bowstring drawn and drawn again, and then it snaps. The Egyptians spill from the pass in waves. First the chariots, dust trailing like banners. Then the infantry, shields raised, eyes scanning the plain. The earth groans beneath their boots, not in tremor but in memory. This place has seen blood before. It remembers. The pharaoh raises his hand. It is a gesture older than writing. His generals form the ranks with calm precision. Standards rise into the morning air, falcon, sun disk, ankh, each a symbol carved into the soul of empire. No horns sound, no cries pierce the stillness, just breath, just the slow beat of sandals finding soil. Until the arrows come. They fall like rain, thin, reed-tipped, hungry. The front lines raise their shields and wait. Behind the gates, the Canaanite archers reload. The city does not speak, but it watches. Windows dark, battlements full, priests pressing their foreheads to stone. Thutmose does not flinch. He rides forward, his chariot steady, his eyes on the city that dares to resist the divine. This is not conquest. This is ritual. For this battle, this siege, it is not about Megiddo. It is about the story Megiddo will allow them to tell. The campaign had begun with rebellion. Vassals shirking tribute, princes whispering alliance, merchants shifting trade routes east. But Thutmose, young yet seasoned, had not answered with diplomacy. He had answered with an army that stretched for miles, with chariots and scribes, with maps inked in the blood of empire. To reclaim Megiddo is to reclaim the world beyond it. The clash begins in earnest. Shield against spear, arrow against flesh. Men scream in tongues long lost to time. The plain becomes a mosaic of fallen banners, broken blades, and the final gasps of forgotten foot soldiers. But this is only the first morning. The city does not fall. As dusk gathers in burnt colors along the ridge, the pharaoh surveys the field. His troops encircle Megiddo now like a noose. The siege begins not with fire, but with silence. Camps are raised. Watchfires lit. The city gates remain closed. Inside, grain stores dwindle by the hour. And yet Thutmose waits. For he understands what many kings forget, that conquest is not measured in hours. It is measured in hunger. in sleep lost to fear, in nights where walls feel thinner and gods feel far. In the dark, beneath a sky riddled with stars and omens, a young Egyptian soldier sits by a dying fire. He fingers the edge of his bronze dagger, watching sparks leap like ghosts into the wind. He is 17. He is never killed. Tomorrow he will be first through the breach. But tonight, he is still a boy beneath linen and oath. In the city, a child cries. Her mother hushes her with stories of rain spirits and jackal-headed gods, but her voice breaks halfway through. There is no more honey for the bread, no more bread for the child, no more hope in the eyes of those who promised protection. Still, the gates do not open. Still, the siege tightens. Still, Thutmose waits. The wind turns cold. The desert remembers its age, and somewhere beyond the plain, a raven circles. It is the first omen of the next act, when hunger gives way to desperation, when gates creak, when walls weep. But for now, the fire dies slowly, and Megiddo dreams of endurance. Twilight lay heavy over the valley, thick as a veil of mourning. The land held its breath, and in that moment, all of creation seemed to kneel. The plain before Megiddo, usually alive with goats and market caravans, now groaned under the weight of assembled war. In the fading light, the shadows of spears stretched long and lean. Canaanite warlords murmured behind their lacquered shields, their voices rough with dust and dread. In the cool chamber of a makeshift temple, beneath a canopy woven from old trade banners, a scribe dipped his reed into black ink, the scent of crushed pine drifting upward. His name would not be remembered, but his task was sacred. Line after line, he marked the day's positions on papyrus. Not for glory. For the gods, perhaps. Or for a time when these names Thutmose, Megiddo, Kadesh might be spoken not with fear, but with awe. Far beyond him, Pharaoh Thutmose's camp glowed with the disciplined hush of preparation. Campfires burned low, their smoke trailing like fingers into the night. Linen tents snapped in the wind. Horses stamped and snorted beside bronze chariots, reins tied in careful knots. The soldiers sat cross-legged around flatbread and figs, their voices muted. No boasts, no songs, just the soft clink of whetstones on blades. The battle, they said, would begin at first light. But in truth, it had already begun, etched in the nervous twitch of fingers, the dreams disturbed by prophecy, the scribbled prayers stuffed into bronze amulets. Pharaoh himself, wreathed in gold and silence, studied the stars. He read in them not only fate, but timing. His eyes, rimmed with kohl, did not blink. He knew what lay ahead. He had chosen it. Inside the city, beyond the walls, the mood was heavier. Mothers wrapped their children in goatskin and soothed them with stories of Baal and Asherah. The elders sharpened tools no longer fit for harvest but for defense. Along the upper ramparts, Canaanite archers rubbed tallow into bowstrings, their faces lit by flickering torchlight. Beneath them, storehouses were sealed, doors bound with ropes woven from camel hair, knotted with charms, dusted with ash. And still, the silence pressed down. Then, as if the gods exhaled, the first horn sounded, low, uncertain, like a question half-asked, then another, and another. From the Egyptian line, a great cry rose, not in triumph but in unity. The ground trembled with the thunder of chariot wheels as the first wave poured from their ranks. Shields up, eyes forward, mouths closed. The Canaanites answered with fire. Arrows lit with pitch arced into the sky, flaming against the dawn like dying stars. They fell upon the Egyptian line in bursts, some finding bronze, some flesh, all met with grim resolve. The pharaoh's front pushed forward, unbroken. Their spears glistened with morning dew and something darker. The battlefield narrowed. From high on the city's gate tower, a horn-bearer turned pale. What had seemed a unified defense began to fray. The coalition of Canaanite lords, once proud, once boastful, wavered. Kadesh pulled left. Tyre hesitated. Hazor stood firm, but alone. The wall of alliance cracked, not from pressure, but from uncertainty. Below in the dust, two lines met. It was not battle in the way poets would later pretend. No grand flourishes, no single champions. It was mud and panic. The grunts of dying men, the groans of horses pierced through the ribs. It was the slap of sandals on blood-slick earth, the scream of a boy too young for this kind of death. Yet still the scribes wrote. From the safety of distant cliffs, the pharaoh's chroniclers noted troop movements, recorded enemy casualties. They wrote of flanking maneuvers and divine favor. But they did not write of the soldier who dropped his spear to clutch the medallion around his neck, or the one who crawled through the muck to cradle his brother's corpse. They did not write about fear. how it stank, how it clung like smoke. As the sun climbed higher, the tide shifted. Canaanite lords, seeing the breach near the north wall, rallied for one final push. Thutmose, calm, signaled his second line forward. Fresh ranks surged across the plain, a curtain of spears, a living wall of purpose. The defenders broke. Some fled to the hills, dropping shields as they ran. Others clawed back into the city, slamming gates behind them. The battlefield fell quiet, but for the moan of the dying, the wind whistling through split banners. Vultures circled, drawn by the scent of iron and flame. The city still stood. But it stood afraid. And Thutmose did not rush. He knew the power of silence. He let the siege begin like rot, slow and sure. Food would dwindle. Tempers would flare. Hope would vanish. He let the city stew in its defiance. In the hours that followed, a boy scribe wrote the final tally on his parchment. Numbers of fallen, ranks of prisoners, estimates of grain captured. He paused before one word: victory. Then he dipped his reed again and wrote it anyway. But war is never finished with one word. Night came again to Megiddo. Torches lined the camp's perimeter like stars fallen to earth. Pharaoh sat beneath his canopy, face aglow with firelight, eyes fixed on the city walls. Somewhere, a priest whispered a hymn to Amun, his voice shaking. Inside Megiddo, the people waited in candlelight. Hunger was already settling in, not famine yet, but its shadow. Children sucked the marrow from old bones. Guards peered from slits in the stone, wondering if their gods would answer soon. And above them all, the stars blinked cold and indifferent. Tomorrow would bring more. Another clash, another scream, another desperate prayer. But tonight, the plain was quiet, and history, like the scribes with their ink, waited, poised to carve what came next. A low groan echoes against the high stone walls of Megiddo as another siege tower lurches into place, an unnatural silhouette in the crimson light of evening. Below, the ground quakes beneath the weight of wood and men, leather ropes stretched taut, iron-bound wheels grinding through churned mud. Ash drifts from the west like snow from a dying world, falling into the courtyards, onto the shoulders of archers, into the grain pots now half empty. From the highest window in the eastern tower, the young prince watches. He does not speak. His fingers rest on the cold sill, stained with the soot of burnt offerings. His shoulders are cloaked in a wool mantle, embroidered once with gold thread, now dulled by dust and sleepless nights. Behind him, his chamber stands still, a copper goblet untouched, a blade untouched, a scroll left open beneath a flickering clay lamp. The stories once written on those scrolls speak of alliances and invincibility. But no parchment tells of what it is to wait. He watches the Egyptian lines shift in silence. Their fires are arranged in perfect rings. Their tents rise and fall like tide and breath. To the west, the pharaoh's personal pavilion glows faintly, a beacon of patience, not power. This siege, the prince knows, is not a scream. It is a slow suffocation. In the streets below, smoke curls through alleyways where no flames burn. It rises from the pits where old armor is melted for nails, from the pots boiling water over bones and barley husks, from the incense altars where priests now kneel with raw voices and empty eyes. Women weave ropes from flax and straw. Not for crafts, not for trade, but to lower water jars into wells that no longer echo with abundance. Each night, the silence grows heavier. Not the silence of peace, but of a city holding its breath too long. The prince descends from his tower only when the bells call for midnight prayer. Their toll is low and strained, rung by a boy too small for war and too old for dreams. In the inner sanctum of the city's temple, the flicker of sacred flame still dances upon the walls, illuminating painted gods with chipped features and weeping eyes. The high priest bends over the altar, laying out offerings no longer fresh. Figs shriveled, wine soured, salt rationed from tears. When the prince kneels, he says no words aloud, but his breath speaks for him. Let the walls hold, let the alliances endure, let the gods not abandon us. He remembers his father's voice, thick with wine and victory, promising that Megiddo would never fall, not to time, nor famine, nor sword. But time has worn through promises. Famine clutches the doorways of the wealthiest homes, and the sword waits just outside. Outside the walls, Egyptian watchmen build makeshift towers from planks and reeds, hauling up archers with ropes creaking in the dawn wind. From there, they see all: the shrinking movements of citizens, the empty fields beyond the gates, the flicker of rebellion in the city's east quarter. Nothing is hidden in siege. Not sorrow, not betrayal. The prince knows this. Each day, he walks the inner wall, hands clasped behind his back, eyes avoiding the dead oxen rotting in the southern street, the mothers who now barter for breadcrumbs with scraps of jewelry, the guards whose armor hangs looser by the day. He pauses at the northern gate, where the main bolts remain sealed with iron and faith. A symbol has been etched into the lintel, an old charm of protection, a serpent devouring its own tail. But the charm has faded, half rubbed away by desperate hands and time's indifferent wind. One guard, younger than most, speaks without turning. They won't wait much longer. The prince does not answer. Instead, he looks at the rusted key on his belt, the key to the inner sanctuary, the gate to the palace stronghold. Not even the generals possess such a key. It is the symbol of trust and of burden, of what must be defended even when the city burns. By the third week, the siege is no longer just a tactic, it is an atmosphere. It clings to lungs, to skin, to the soul. A child is found dead near the cistern, her hands still clasped around a ragged doll. The baker's wife collapses in the marketplace, her body too thin to rise. At dusk, a runner from Kadesh tries to break through the western fields. He is caught. His body is left visible near the outer trench, a message not of cruelty, but inevitability. That night, the prince does not sleep. He walks the roof of the old archives, the stars overhead smudged by smoke. Somewhere below, dogs howl in alleys gone feral. The moon is a dull copper coin, spinning slowly above a city, too proud to surrender and too weak to resist forever. He kneels at the edge of the roof, gripping the carved stone railing, and speaks to no one. Let it not be for nothing. Let our hunger write its name into stone. There is no reply, only the night wind carrying the scent of dry earth, stale sweat, and distant incense. When morning comes, the Egyptian lines remain still. No assault, no envoy. Just the stare of discipline, just the tightening noose of time. In the temple, the high priest opens the sacred chest once each morning now. He lays bare the bones of the ancestors, wrapped in cloths dyed with pomegranate and ochre. He asks for guidance. He receives silence. The prince attends the ceremony. He watches the priest's hands tremble as they anoint the altar. He watches the oil spill too fast, too much, and senses what the priest will not say. The gods are watching, but they are waiting too, waiting to see what men will do when prayers are met with silence. When he returns to his chamber, the prince wraps his mantle around him once more. He opens the scroll still resting on his desk. He takes up the reed pen. His vow must be written now, before the gates open or the city breaks. His hand does not shake as he writes. If we fall, let it be known that we held, that we did not break beneath siege or silence, that even in hunger, our hearts were steel. The ink dries quickly. He sets the scroll aside. Outside, a raven circles once, twice, then vanishes behind the tower spire. The city is still, but not for long, because silence has begun to crack, and in the next breath, it will break. The sound began like thunder muffled by earth, distant, rhythmic, deliberate. Then came the splintering, the scream of timber against iron, and the desperate groan of the southern gate as it gave way at last. Not with glory, not with spectacle, but with a sorrowful, grinding collapse like an oath being broken in slow motion. Dust billowed into the square like a ghost returned. It choked the air, caught in lungs already thinned by hunger, settled on skin and teeth and prayer beads. The bells did not ring. There was no need. Every soul in Megiddo felt it. The breach. In the temple court, the oil lamps guttered. The flame nearest the high altar extinguished on its own, flickering once, then gone. A priest's hand trembled over the sacred flame, ash smearing across his palm. The last goat had already been sacrificed the day before. Now, the silence in the sanctum was no longer reverence. It was abandonment. From the shattered gate, they poured in. Egyptian infantry in bronze, boots pounding against blood-slick stone, faces smeared with soot and grit. The clatter of shields echoed down corridors, through archways, into the hidden places where the last defenders stood their ground. Sword met spear, flesh met fire, hope met steel. A Canaanite commander, a man once draped in perfumes and coin-laced robes, stood atop the city steps in armor too large for his aging frame. He did not speak. His final command came in the tilt of his chin, the steadiness of his hand. One last stand, one last offering of dignity before the storm swallowed them whole. Arrows rained from the rooftops, banners fell into the dust, screams curled into the sky and dissolved into the rising heat. But inside the palace walls, the prince had not fled. He stood barefoot on the cold marble of the great hall, its once polished surface now littered with scrolls, torn silks, and the feathers of a ceremonial headdress that had meant something once. His cloak was gone. His voice had dried hours ago. In one hand, he still held the copper goblet, now empty, its rim smeared with a single line of soot. In the other, the rusted key. The sanctuary lay behind him, the threshold untouched. He had vowed to hold it. He had not vowed to win. Outside, the clash had slowed. Not stopped, but slowed, its ferocity replaced by the heavy weight of inevitability. Resistance became retreat. Retreat became silence. Those who remained alive hid, not from fear, but from the shame of surviving. Smoke slipped under doorways, curled up staircases, and wrapped around statues like silk scarves. In the palace kitchen, clay pots shattered from the heat. In the prayer halls, tapestries burned from the bottom up. A young soldier, Egyptian, his eyes rimmed with sweat, knelt beside a fountain and cupped the water to his lips. He did not see the prince. He did not care. Hunger and war make strangers of even the sacred. Farther down, a woman screamed once, then did not scream again. The prince turned away from the sound. He moved instead to the inner chamber, where the last of his ancestors were buried beneath painted tiles. The air was damp with the memory of incense and old tears. He knelt there, not to pray, but to listen. And what he heard was not the voice of a god. It was the city exhaling its final breath. He set the key beside the tomb. He placed the goblet next to it. Then he rose and walked out into the smoke. By mid-afternoon, the pharaoh stood in the city square. He said nothing. His soldiers fanned out through the streets, dragging the wounded into makeshift camps, gathering weapons, unrolling scrolls. But the pharaoh did not speak. His gaze swept the remains of the city, not with vengeance, but with gravity. Not conquest, but ceremony. Beside him, a scribe dipped his brush into ink and began to write. On this day, the walls fell. On this day, the city that defied empire bent its neck. But history does not end in a signature. Near the breach, a small procession emerged, elders, women, children. Hands raised, feet bare, faces streaked with ash. They did not plead. They did not curse. They offered only silence. And that silence, for a moment, became the holiest sound of all. In the western quarter, a child picked up a broken blade and turned it in his hands. He did not know who it belonged to. He would never wield it. But he held it like a relic, like something worth remembering. By dusk, the fires had mostly burned out. The smoke thinned into twilight. The birds returned. A priest wandered the ruins of the temple. His robe was torn. His staff snapped. He moved slowly, as if each step might be the last. In his hands, he carried a single scroll, the last prophecy never read aloud. And in the silence that followed, one door, long rusted, swung gently open on its hinge. It creaked as it moved, not from wind, not from hand, from time. A symbol, a sound, a question. What remains after the walls fall? In the ruins of Megiddo, the answer was not stone. It was not victory. It was not even survival. It was memory. The siege had ended, but the story, like ash in the wind, was only beginning to settle. And in the next breath, it would drift onward, into the hands of those who would carve the empire, carry the tribute, write the next prayer in ink darker than blood. The chisel struck stone with a sound like time breathing. In the temple of Karnak, deep within the sacred halls where light dared only to flicker, the granite walls bore the weight of gods in war. It was here that memory was made permanent, not in hearts which fail, nor in minds which forget, but in stone which endures. The torchlight cast long shadows over the figures of the scribes as they carved. They did not speak. The air between them smelled of ink and dust, old resin and quiet reverence. The Battle of Megiddo had ended, not with a single death blow, but with the slow folding of pride beneath siege and silence. Now, in the cool belly of the temple, Pharaoh Thutmose's victory was being given to eternity. The scribe Chanani sat upon a mat woven from palm fibers, brush in hand, his fingers stained dark with soot and gum. He watched as his fellow artisans chiseled Pharaoh's words into the limestone with rhythmic precision. His task was simpler, but no less sacred. Line by line, he inked the hieroglyphs on papyrus, the campaign, the siege, the surrender, the god's favor, the fate of princes. But as he worked, he could not forget what had been seen. He had been there on the field of Megiddo, beneath a tent soaked with dew, writing as arrows fell like fire. He had recorded the count of horses, the names of the vassal kings, the inventory of plundered goods. armor, gold. The copper from temple doors, the chariots seized from broken noblemen. The ink he used today was the same that once ran dry on that field, mixed with Nile water and bitterness. His eyes flicked to the wall as another figure took shape. Thutmose in his war chariot, bow drawn, falcon standard behind him. At his feet, the bound figures of conquered kings, heads lowered, hands tied with cords like cattle. Their names, too, would be carved here. The enemies of Egypt, the defiers of order. But the scribe knew more than names. He remembered the boy prince who refused to flee, the Canaanite matron who passed bread through the siege wall to the sick, the screams that had echoed through Megiddo's stone alleys before the gates gave way. And still he wrote. The temple itself whispered with the weight of it all. Every column, thick as 10 men, was inscribed with generations of triumph and devotion. Oil lamps lined the path toward the sanctum, their flames like watchful eyes. Somewhere behind the scribe, priests chanted over offerings, pomegranates, bread, dried fish, arranged in a mosaic of peace returned. The pharaoh's statue, cut from obsidian, loomed above all, unmoved. And yet, here, even peace wore a mask of conquest. The scribe paused, the brush resting against the parchment. He stared at the symbol for enemy, a man, arms raised, mouth agape. There was no glyph for grief, no word for remorse that stone could carry. Still, the pharaoh had decreed it. Megiddo must be recorded, not as warning, as legacy. It was more than a victory. It was a demonstration. To rebel was to be encircled. To stand proud was to be starved. To resist was to be remembered as fallen. So the temple walls became a litany of obedience, of blood well spent. A scribe across the hall lit a fresh lamp. Its light flared briefly, casting the wall reliefs into sharper relief, swords raised, sun discs radiant, the pharaoh in divine stance. Between his feet, a line of cattle trampled beneath chariot wheels. The price of wheat, the measure of tribute, the tally of captured boughs, every detail was etched with care. Even the date of surrender was exact. And yet there was no carving for the girl who wept behind the Megiddo altar. No figure for the priest who burned his final scroll when the walls began to fall. They had vanished, even as they lived. Channi dipped the brush again and continued. His hands moved swiftly, the symbols forming in practiced flow. But his mind drifted. He thought of the temples of the Canaanite gods, now blackened and quiet. He thought of their children, taught now to praise the pharaoh as divine, their local gods erased or renamed. He thought of the prisoners, marched southward in silence, their names no longer spoken. And still, he wrote. He was not a rebel. He was not a fool. His role was to remember. But he wondered quietly if memory was not a kind of war too. One more glyph, one more name, one more line. By dusk, the hall began to fill with incense. Outside, the Nile moved slow and silver, reflecting the last of the light. The chant of the priests rose in rhythm with the river's hush. The pharaoh, they said, would come to witness the final carving tomorrow. His blessing would consecrate the wall. The city would gather. Bread would be broken, stories told. And Megiddo would become stone. Chanini laid down his brush. He stood and approached the wall, trailing his fingers gently over the still wet hieroglyphs. The stone was cool, the carvings deep. They would last perhaps 1,000 years, longer than any kingdom, longer than any breath. He touched the name of Thutmose, carved with grandeur and divine flares. Then lower, the word for victory, beside the bound silhouettes of kings. But as he stepped back, he imagined another scene, a scene never carved. The Prince of Megiddo in his chamber, placing a rusted key upon a tomb, the flames devouring a banner stitched with faith, a mother whispering, "Remember us," to a child she would not see grown. Giannini saw them, just for a moment, and then they were gone. The torch beside him guttered once, then steadied. He turned away, left the temple, and walked into the evening air. A breeze stirred from the river, cool and fragrant with reed and blossom. Somewhere across the courtyard, a lute began to play, its notes soft and slow. Behind him, the temple doors closed. The wall remained. But the truth he knew had already slipped through the cracks. And in the next chamber, stone waited again, blank, vast, and hungry, waiting for the next memory, the next myth, the next name to outlive its breath. The fire crackled low, its embers painting the undersides of tents in flickering red. In the hush between drums and dawn, the battlefield no longer wept, it whispered. The plain of Megiddo, once torn with hoofprint and blade, now lay still under the stars, like a wound beginning to clot. Pharaoh Thutmose III stood at the edge of the camp, his cloak pressed flat by the breeze. His sandals rested on dry, blood-stained earth, and before him stretched a canvas of silence. The valley subdued, the city broken, the world changed. He did not smile. Victory had not come with horns and cheers. It had come with attrition, with ash, with men burying their own brothers beside half-burned grain stores. It had come with patience. And now, in the smoldering calm, the pharaoh did what only empire can afford to do after conquest. He watched. Beyond the outer palisades, Megiddo stood quiet beneath its tell. Smoke still rose from collapsed roofs. A woman, her tunic smeared with soot, lifted a broken door from the street. A child led a goat through rubble. And in the shadow of the city wall, a funeral pyre crackled for both victor and vanquished. But this was no longer a Canaanite stronghold. It was now something else. A boundary. A declaration. A cornerstone. In the sand beside Thutmose's chariot, a map had been drawn. Crude lines in dirt, punctuated with carved tokens. Stone cities, copper trade hubs, water routes. Every inch taken was a thread sewn tighter around the edge of empire. This wasn't conquest for land. It was conquest for memory, for meaning, for permanence. Behind him, scribes scurried between tents, hands stained with ink, arms heavy with scrolls. The tribute was being recorded, chariots offered in surrender, livestock traded for mercy, hostages sent to Thebes for safekeeping. The king of Kadesh had bent the knee. The prince of Tyre had sent his heir in chains. And the wealth of Megiddo, its silks, its spices, its old bronze idols, would soon sail down the Nile in tribute caravans that shimmered like serpents beneath the sun. In the far corner of the camp, soldiers stacked shields once used in defiance. Spears were sorted, bows unstrung. Each was labeled, weighed, inventoried. Not for war, for ceremony. History, after all, is not built with battles. It is built with order. And in the order that followed, the empire was reborn. Merchants, once bound by regional loyalties, now filed taxes to the pharaoh's agents. Messengers rode out, bearing decrees on lotus-stamped parchment. Markets reopened, first cautiously, then with swelling confidence. Even the survivors of Megiddo, bruised and shorn, began to trade again. Among the ashes, humanity bloomed. At night, the campfire smoke curled upward into a sky where falcons circled in silence. The soldiers no longer sharpened their blades. They cleaned them. They wrapped them. They prepared them, not for use, but for procession. Because when Pharaoh returned to Thebes, it would not be in shadow. It would be in splendor. There would be murals, songs, banners raised from ivory poles, gold bracelets gifted to generals who survived, and whispered blessings offered for those who did not. But not all rejoiced. A carpenter, pressed into service building new watchtowers from Megiddo's broken beams, wiped sweat from his brow and stared out toward the city. He had lived there once. His sister still did, perhaps. But now he built for Egypt. Not by choice, but by silence. And so the stones were laid. A road, cut through the valley by Thutmose's engineers, now stretched from Megiddo's edge all the way to Gaza. Through it, grain would flow, and copper, and soldiers. But beneath its surface, trodden under wheels and sandals, was something else. Memory. Of nights spent in siege, of bread broken in secret, of a prince's vow carved into scrolls that would never be read aloud. Memory does not vanish with surrender. It walks alongside victory, quietly, waiting. In the pharaoh's pavilion, a lotus bowl steamed with sweet herbs. He dipped his fingers into it slowly, rubbing the oils into calloused palms. Across from him, a general knelt, speaking softly of border towns, of fortresses still loyal to the old alliances. Thutmose said nothing. He simply reached forward and placed a single obsidian token on the map. The general nodded. They would march again. Not tomorrow, but soon. For empire is not satisfied with silence. It hungers for echoes. And Megiddo had taught them something, that walls fall not to force but to time, that fear spreads quicker than fire, that patience was the sharpest weapon of all. When the sun rose again, its rays struck the hilltops first, then fell across the city's broken gate. The banners of Egypt, golden falcon on black, fluttered above the ruins. A boy climbed the stairs of what remained of the east tower, carrying a reed basket of grain. He placed it down beside a stone, then knelt, pressing his fingers to the earth. "Thank you," he whispered. "Not to Egypt, not to Pharaoh, to the wind, to the walls that once held, to the ghosts that now fed the soil." Back in Karnak, the walls were already being carved. Thutmose's face, triumphant, the fallen princes kneeling, the tally of tribute, Exact. The empire, eternal. But what the walls would not say, what they could never say, was how the land remembered differently. How the trees left untouched beyond the battlefield still leaned toward the city like mourners. How the breeze that once carried smoke now carried prayers, half forgotten. And how every stone laid by empire bore beneath it one silent uncarved name. One that the earth, not history, would remember. The empire had begun, but the echo of Megiddo was still walking, still whispering. And in the next valley just beyond the rise, another city listened.